want to talk about my favorite weapon in Splatoon 2, the Splat Brella, and what I want to see them do to change it up in Splatoon 3. For those of you who are familiar with me, you know that I'm a competitive player and I have flexed between many different weapons throughout the game's history, but it's really extremely rare to ever see me on Brella at this point in any competitive format, despite it being my favorite next to other weapons such as Explosher or Tenta Brella. So some of you might be wondering why that is exactly, so I wanted to make a video where I talk about that a bit and I talk about the issues I think Brella is seriously suffering from in Splatoon 2 and to talk about this sort of identity crisis that I think it finds itself in right now. And then I want to talk about what I think the developers can do to make the weapon stand out a bit more again in Splatoon 3 so we can have some more reason to pick it. Now, I could gush on for a super long time about why Brella used to accomplish being one of the most distinctive weapons Splatoon had, and it seriously pulled me in and became my favorite because when it came to playing Splatoon, the weird options are what enticed me to play it in the first place. When I saw Roller in Splatoon 1, I said that's super cool, and so Brella being a weapon with a completely unique playstyle with sort of a shotgun main weapon but a shield mechanic attached to it was super duper interesting to me. Those of you who have played the game long enough know that there actually were periods in this game where both variants of Brella were considered pretty strong, so first I want to dive into why they used to be strong by talking a little bit about the patch history of Brella itself. If we start by looking at the patch history for Splat Brella in 2, we can immediately see that the developers considered it to be a bit underwhelming at launch because it received around 7 different buffs in version 1.4.0, which shifted the weapon immediately from a sort of weird gimmick that you would look at and say, yeah, I guess that could be sort of cool, and it changed that completely into a legitimate threat that made you very afraid to see a competent player running around with. So to quickly go over those, among the 1.4.0 buffs were a ton of quality of life buffs, including faster shield startup, increased movement speed with your shield up, increased more consistent damage values, increased durability against shooters, splatlings, and dualies, no longer breaking upon contact with Baller instantly, and increased damage versus Baller itself. Funnily, in 1.3, which I believe was the patch where Baller was extremely overtuned, it was an incredibly anti-Brella special because simply running into the Brella would delete the shield from full HP, which was kind of funny. So 1.4.0 stood as the absolute peak of Brella as a main weapon because the weapon would go on to receive many different nerfs as time would go by in the game. But what we can gauge from these patches is what the developers intended Brella to be as a weapon. It seems they wanted it to be a counterbalance weapon that was meant to be strong at combating dualies, shooters, and splatlings, and I want you to keep that in mind as we go. At its absolute peak, the weapon actually did serve as a very strong answer to many weapons in these classes. But did you know that the most important patch note that you can do to change this channel is to subscribe if you haven't already? Right now I'm pushing for 1,000 subs and I'm trying to hit that before Splatoon 3, and we're actually not too far off. I believe we're around 900 as of the time I'm uploading this video. If you want to see more videos like this, then the best change that you can implement right now is to hit subscribe. But going back to earlier days of Splatoon 2 and the weapons that you used to see, there were many common weapons such as Enfury, which was a weapon that seriously struggled to fight Brella because it had a similar range even after the buff. It was a dually weapon class, it had a curling bomb so it didn't really have the means to shred Brella's shield, and this was before Inkjet got buffed against the Brella class to do increased damage, so Inkjet actually wasn't amazing at killing Brellas back then. So the weapon was one that was extremely common, easily exploited by Brella, because if you were dodge rolling, you can't shoot with the main weapon, so Brella would easily take advantage of that by either changing the space it's at, or it would take a shot at the dually for free, basically. We know that the weapon has had a very strong place in the game for quite a while, but the weapon has always been difficult to play effectively, and that's due to a myriad of factors. And that is, it has a very short range. It has only average painting, its kits aren't stellar and don't have a particularly strong stranglehold over neutral the way some other kits do. And the way that Brella plays tends to be pretty committal. And on top of that, we're talking about a weapon that severely struggles in a game with netcode as poor as Splatoon's because sometimes it loses interactions it simply should not. So that's all factors to consider when talking about this weapon. I've talked about it a lot on my own streams, but I think having top tiers in games that have clear strengths and much room to grow, but aren't incredibly easy to master, make for the most interesting types of strong picks. I was a big fan of seeing Brella be as strong as it was, in spite of it just being my favorite. When it comes to top tiers like that, they allow people to sort of develop their own styles of play where they can express personality due to a myriad of different strong points. In the case of Brella back then, it felt like if you compare two different Brella players that were pretty strong, they might be different in the way that they play. One might have incredible stalling capability, be very good at staying alive and baiting for their team, while another might be a lot more aggressive but be really consistent at two-shotting. So I like having weapons like that where there's a clear difference in how different people play. I think that a good example of this is Vanilla Brella back then because the Inkstorm was pretty basic looking special at a glance, but I think it was really fun on Brella specifically because back then Brella had 90 damage on direct, and because it was on Brella and you had a shield, if you got a 90 damage hit on someone that tried to challenge the Brella in the rain, it pretty much made a checkmate scenario where the person might die if they engaged the Brella at all. So it was really good at naturally forcing people to respect its space, which I think was really fun. Brella, on the other hand, was a weapon that was able to build bomb rush fairly quickly. It used to be 180, and it could solve for itself uniquely because very few bomb rush weapons have a secondary tool to make them, safe. A lot of bomb rushes, they tend to expose themselves once they pop it. I think the other weapon that has a similar nature to Brella was Firefin, and that was another meta weapon at one point because it had a splash wall sub where it could easily set up the wall, pop a suction bomb rush, and then create some space. And what was cool about Brella is because it had a shield, if someone tried to do the typical thing where if they want to punish a bomb rusher by engaging it and killing it or trading it, Brella could easily roll a spot bomb at someone's feet, open the shield, stall them, potentially combo them, and I think that was really, really fun and what made that weapon feel really special to me back then. So okay, let's fast forward a bit to the current age of Splatoon 2 and ask ourselves a similar question that I just did again. How strong are the current weapon classes that Brella is meant to be an answer to? If we talk about the Spotlight class first, beyond the Mini and the Nautilus, you don't really see a ton of this weapon class anymore, so that niche isn't really as important as it used to be, because back in those days, weapons like Heavy were a lot more common, and those types of weapons have fallen out of favor due to having a bit of a weaker crossfiring, weaker damage value because of nerfs, higher gear depends because you want run speed on that kind of weapon, and has a charge time that affects its range, compared to a very frequent anchor weapon you might see now, such as the Jet Sculpture and the Custom Jet, which possess the traits of a shooter, which is really, really good, as I'll talk about in a bit, and they possess stronger kits overall and cheaper specials, while also being easier to play. When it comes to dualies, a lot of them also fell super far out of meta, being denied by many additions, such as the introduction of main power, which was damage, and particularly Bamboo, I think is the most notable of those, amongst increased power level, among other similarly ranged options that have stronger kits, and I think specifically the introduction of Kensa 52, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, has a very, very positive matchup against that weapon, because when it comes to that weapon, it has a faster kill time, it's able to put the wall down, it moves more freely, it can stall out dualies, deny them when they try and challenge it, and it's very, very good at denying dualies from having space. And if that sounds familiar and comparable to Brella, it is, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a tiny bit. So, okay, you might be wondering, what about shooters then, Keen? I am pretty sure that shooters are everywhere right now, and you just mentioned K52 is very relevant right now, and that's a shooter that has no bomb. Shouldn't that be the perfect environment for Brella to thrive? And you might have a point if it wasn't for a mix of factors, and the first one I'm going to talk about is all the nerfs that Brella got absolutely bombarded with between its peak in 1.4 as a main weapon and now. This, combined with continuous buffs to the shooter weapon class, a class that was never truly bad because it lacks many true weaknesses by being the all-rounder class of weapons, you'll quickly begin to understand, as I explain here, the level of power creep in both directions, where Brella is constantly on a downward spiral and shooters are on a constant upward spiral. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the nerfs that Brella got. For main weapon nerfs, Brella had to suffer from a paint decrease, even though it wasn't, amazing back then. It was maybe average, maybe a little bit above average for the power level back then, but it had a paint nerf. That's big in this game. It means you build less special, it means you're less efficient at creating your own space, and it heavily lowers its usefulness in paint wars, which leads to a lot of struggles in terms of trying to keep up against many common heavy painting comps, which you'll see nowadays with a ton of shooter examples being, you'll see Juniors, 85s, Neo Splashes, K-Gal's really good at painting, K-Shot, amidst other weapons that are really, really strong at painting. In the base version of Splatoon 2, when Brella was first introduced to us, it used to have 20 shots on its ink tank by default, assuming you don't even open shield. After multiple nerfs to ink efficiency, it is only down to 15, which is approximately a 33% decrease in the amount of shots you have, in addition to the paint nerf that we just talked about, and this isn't even to begin to how ink hungry it is to open the shield even a little bit. So when it comes to Brella, if it wants to paint a little bit, it might have to shoot 5 or 6 times, and at that point you have to deal with white ink, you're down quite a bit on your ink tank, especially if you open shield at any point. So it feels like you have a lot of downtime with the weapon, and I'll mention that again as we go. So putting Brella to the side for a second, I want to talk about how other main weapons have been adjusted in this game and how that directly impacts Brella on top of Brella getting nerfed itself. As, again, Brella's on that downward trend, a lot of other weapons since the patch of 1.4 have only been getting better and better and better. Previously, positive matchups that people would consider really, really winning for Brella only got worse as the Brella nerfs happened, but also there were a lot of buffs specifically against Brella. I think 2 good examples of this are Squeezer and 96 Gal. Squeezer especially, because Squeezer is a very common top-tier threat in the current meta, and Squeezer and 96 both receive damage buffs to Brella's shield, which increase their ability to crossfire for their teammates at long range and shred the shield a lot more easily, which already weakens its stalling ability, which is one of its perks. On top of that, when we go back to the main power edition, for many weapons that was damage up, and that directly affects Brella's shield. So a lot of the HP values that were probably a bit more carefully tweaked in the earlier patches of the game end up getting a little bit more skewed here and there, and a lot of weapons have an easier time breaking the shield as a whole. Spot Charger, I think, is a really good example for this, and this is one that I experienced a lot having played competitive Brella before the fact and after the fact of main power, because with Charger, it does 160 damage without main power. As of version 2.1.0 in Splatoon 3, Spot Charger has a ×3 multiplier damage on Brella. Brella has about 500 HP without being detached, so what that means is 160 at full charge would become 480 out of 500, or practically the whole shield at a full shot, on a weapon that has a lot of range, and is really good at just punishing Brella for trying to stand in the open, so that's already pretty bad. But if you account for main power on top of that, what a lot of Charger players were doing is if they saw any Brella, they could run 3 subs of main power, which is damage up for them, and it would increase the threshold of their damage with the multiplier, so that they can one-shot the Brella shield from full health. No questions asked. And that is really, really bad, because I challenge you to try and fight a strong Charger player who can snap your shield off that consistently, that easily, when the downtime to regenerate your shield is about 6.5 seconds. That's really hard. Good luck playing the game versus a strong Charger who will hit you consistently. And that's not even the worst case of it, because when it comes to Bamboozler and main power, that was already considered one of Brella's worst matchups, because in the base game it had 80 damage, and at one point it got buffed to 85. That weapon has about 20-ish frames of charge time, so it could easily 2-tap at a very long range that Brella can't contest and shred the shield for its teammates super duper easily. But now Bamboos are running main power, and main power would increase the damage to around the 99 threshold. Some people run a little bit more, like 99.4, 99.6, basically in that range. So if you apply the multiplier that Charger gets against Brella, it gets really bad, really, really fast. It's a weapon with insane charge speed, so Brella has an absolutely miserable time. But okay, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, not every comp has a Charger Keen, so it doesn't get worse than that, right? Charger's supposed to be the worst matchup for Brella, yes? Well, it gets a little bit worse than that, maybe a lot bit worse than that, actually. Now I want to talk about sub-weapon adjustments in this game, specifically one. Between 1.4 and now, the devs made one key adjustment to one sub-weapon that I think has drastically warped Brella in how it fights many different weapons in that game, and that is the damage buff to Suction Bomb. In patches back then, a Suction Bomb did 180 damage maximum. And what they did is they said, okay, Splat Bomb is debatably better, even though Suction was always good, definitely a top 3 bomb at worst in this game. They took the damage value of 180 and changed it to 220. Bombs have about a double multiplier on Brella shields, so you go from 360 out of your 500 health, about 70%, 72% of your HP gone from one Suction Bomb, into 220, which becomes 440. So you go from 72% of your shield getting shredded by Suction to 88%. So only having 20% the second any Suction Bomb player throws correctly at your shield is really, really, really bad, because that basically means pretty much every weapon in the game, after a couple more bullets or shots, the shield is gone, and there goes your gimmick really, really fast in a low committal fashion. And that was massive because it drastically warped matchups against weapons, specifically NZAP comes to mind, because NZAP was a weapon with a very low base damage of 28. It has a high fire rate, but it struggled to break Brella's shield without use of the Suction. But now, with the increased Suction damage, the weapon matchup becomes a lot more easy, because even if the NZAP doesn't have to contest the Brella exactly by itself, which it definitely doesn't have to because it's a lightweight shooter and they can do whatever they want basically, as I'll talk about more in a second. The NZAP now possesses the ability on command with a bomb in hand to basically delete the Brella shield on command, or even if they don't delete it, the Brella player isn't really gonna commit to something if their shield is practically entirely shredded. So even just throwing the bomb or having the threat of the bomb from a safe distance alone dissuades the Brella from wanting to go for any kinds of plays against weapons that tend to have suctions. So that by itself makes a lot of plays more dangerous for Brella. And again, this is on one of the top 2 subs in the game. You can debate Suction as the best, you can debate Splat Bomb as the best, it doesn't matter. You're going to see Suction Bombs on practically every comp you fight. And I'm going to remind you, when you make a gimmick weapon like Brella and you decide to weaken its strengths, it only detracts from the people who wish to put the time and effort into them, because when it comes to competitive players, it's going to come down to the question if they're at a high enough level. Is it worth learning this weapon if I want to aim for the top and win? And in the case of the current Brella and Splatoon 2's basically final patch at this point, I'd absolutely tell you no, despite it being my favorite weapon at its peaks. I think that the identity of the weapon and its niche have fallen completely to the wayside, only to feel effective versus players that are unaware of how to exploit its weaknesses very, very badly. When the weaknesses of Brella in its current state are abused, the weapon falters, and really, really badly at that. It's It's a weapon that cannot paint well. It has immense periods of downtime between white ink and the ink nerfs. It loses paint wars. Its kill times are very inconsistent as of damage nerfs if you aren't perfect, and you're forced to run mobility to even have a chance to try and catch a lot of the more mobile weapons in this game. Even if you feel like you're playing the weapon perfectly, sometimes you're not even given the chance to 3-shot someone because, again, of how mobile so many of the top tiers are in this game right now, or how easily they can run away and ignore you. The special cost of Brella is high relative to others because of a bygone era of usage. You have all of the use weaknesses and a 200 special, but you have plenty of top tiers running around such as Vanilla Jet with 180, Custom Jet with 190, K-Shot with 180, and a lot of weapons like this paint better, or they paint at longer ranges, safer ranges, they have more thorough paint, they're more ink efficient than you, they have stronger kits than you, more mobility. And the list goes on and on and on. Brella is an incredibly gear-dependent weapon because when it comes to your short range and lack of ink efficiency, you basically need heavy mobility to even have a chance to catch all these weapons with better frame data than you, especially the lightweight weapons, again, such as NZAP, Junior, Neo Splash, etc. Your nerf damage leads to worse kill times, and you have worse ability to shred things like armor. It's a lot more inconsistent than it used to be. Booyah Bomb, I think, mandates another shot. Splash walls are a nightmare with K-Gal everywhere. If you don't run Object Shredder, you're basically forced to, otherwise you're going to sit there, and even if you do run Object Shredder, you might throw a bomb, shoot once, there goes half your ink tank, good luck fighting with the other half of it when the weapon can just sort of peek in and out of your range really, really quickly. So now I want to talk for a second about, yeah, Brella's been nerfed a ton, but there's more issues on top of that within the game itself, and that's the fact that it got power crept by new options. I think the worst insult of all when it comes to Brella's problems in Splatoon 2 is that they introduced a weapon in version 4.3.0 of the game, and that weapon was never truly bad. It was simply not seen for a while, but it got an absolutely ridiculous, numerous amount of buffs when I never even thought the weapon was that badly in the first place. And on top of that, the weapon has been dominating online solo queue usage for quite a while now, definitely over a year at this point. And when they finally decided it's time to nerf it, they just baby tapped it with like 2 tiny, completely negligible nerfs that don't even impact how it plays in the slightest. Meanwhile, Brella had to sit there and eat the entire clip of Nerf gun bullets by itself and got completely neutered, basically. What I'm talking about is the Kensa 52 gal, because it basically got away with the murder of any reason to pick Splat Brella if you want to win and want a weapon with a similar playstyle. Because when it comes to Kensa 52, if you want to compare them directly in terms of main weapon, when it comes to K52, it is more consistent. It is less susceptible to lag. It is more immediately threatening with a much better kill time than Brella does even with a perfect 2-shot. K52 is a shooter, and because of the quicker kill time, it is capable of sharking in very, very scary ways because of that really quick kill time. It has immense clutch factor. It has more safety because Wall has much more durability than Brella Shield does. It has less commitment due to having better ink efficiency and better frame data than Brella does. It is a shooter, so by nature it is far easier to play than Brella. It is gear independent. You can run 2+ mains with Swim if you really, really want. You can run main power, stealth jump, value subs, pretty much anything goes because you don't need gear to function in this game like Brella needs mobility. It has a higher paint output than Brella, it has a cheaper special cost even after said nerf because it's only 190, but again, this is a weapon with far less downtime, far better painting, so it's going to get specials a lot more frequently. Even with 190 cost without special charge, K-Gal can easily get 8 Booyah Bombs in a game, no questions. It's a weapon that has better matchups across the board than Brella does. It possesses better stalling capability because again, the shield is more durable, the weapon is more mobile, it is able to kill. When it comes to a weapon like Brella, if it takes a fight and tries to stall 2 people, if it doesn't end up killing the first player in a 1v2, let's say, it'll become a lot harder and it can become overwhelmed very, very quickly. But because K-Gal has better mobility, better kill time, K-Gal can kind of sort of take those fights, and if it manages to kill one of those players, now the other player is stuck in a 1v1 with K-Gal, and that's not a good look for basically any weapon in this game. And again, if you combine all these factors, K-Gal is just clearly a lot more self-sufficient, and that's huge in a game like this, because you can run a lot of less powerful options on team comps if you build around them. But if you're coming from the objective point of view of, do I really want to run this, and if I do, what do I need to support it? Pretty much the only time you see Brella these days is if you slot with a bunch of top tier shooters that can like somewhat supplement it, but even then, at the end of the day, a lot of the times you'd rather just have the K-Gal on your team. So okay, if you want to make the argument in spite of all that, all of those positive strengths that K-Gal has over Brella right now, what have I not talked about in that list that you would mention as an argument for Brella? The answer is probably kits. Here's the problem, if Brella had a kit that made it a lot more distinct, strong, if it had a particular niche, I would mention it. I can't genuinely say that for Brella. Starting with the vanilla Brella, Sprinkler is one of the worst, if not absolute worst subs in the game, losing hard to the absolutely omnipresent Object Shredder with any damage value attached. Any K-shots run it, NZAPs run it, foil squeezers run it, jet sculptures run it, custom jet sculptures run it, the list goes on and on and on and on. You're gonna spend 60% of your ink tank for a sub that barely paints anything, dies to any damage value with OS. It's just not good. There's basically no weapons in the meta that you really see that have Sprinkler, and if you do see them, it's not really because of the Sprinkler. If I'm picking a weapon like 96, it's because it is a longer range shooter with 70 plus damage on its main power, induced bullets, and has an ink armor at a fairly cheap cost. That's why. It's not because of the Sprinkler. So that part of the Brella is out of the question. When it comes to Inkstorm is an okay special. It doesn't drastically warp the game in a way such as Ink Armor or Tenna Missile, so it's not on that level of threat. On top of that, even after they attempted to rebuff Vanilla Brella and reduce its range from 200 back down to 190, it didn't really do anything, because the main problem with that is Inkstorm used to be good on Brella because of the thing I mentioned earlier, where if you do 90 damage and someone tries to challenge you in the rain, they will die. But because of the nerf damage values, it's worse at doing that. It went from 90 damage max to 81, and there's a drastic difference in the kill time for something like Inkstorm from a player at 10 HP compared to a player at 19. That is a drastic difference. The threat of that, the niche of that, is pretty much out the window. Okay, let's talk about Brella. It's clearly the better of the two kits in the current state. Brella is a weapon that struggles immensely with Shark, so you might be thinking Autobomb is pretty cool for that. But the problem with that is when you combine all the ink efficiency nerfs on Brella, Autobomb, even in its current state with a 55% of its ink tank for being thrown, might not seem so expensive to a lot of weapons. Problem is, with Brella that's over half the ink tank, so let's assume you don't have any efficiency, that basically leaves you with about 6 or 7 shots to play the game, assume you're not even opening shield to do something as a follow-up. You might see the problem with that, it's not really great. You can't really have a sub that takes over half its ink tank and has a fair bit of whiting on top of that, and expect that to work on a weapon that struggles with sharks when the main weapon itself is an absolute ink guzzler. It's not great. Armor, however, is kind of a cool X factor that complements the main weapon well, but again, when you nerf the damage values of Brella, it ruined a lot of the combo ability, and your output is far, far lower because you went from 180 cost to 200 on top of more downtime, which means you paint less, and you paint less with the main weapon because that got nerfed as well. So all around, it's building less specials, it paints less frequently, it has more downtime. The actual lethal part of the special, when combined with the main weapon, its potency has been reduced drastically as well. So it's rough. It's really, really, really rough. So now, let's talk about the good part. What do I want the developers to do? What do I hope the developers do for this main weapon when it comes to the sequel, Splatoon 3, which is coming out in less than 3 months, actually? I've talked about this in depth with quite a few friends, but I think that there's ultimately a couple of ways that the developers could go to make Brella relevant again. But I want to say and remind you that I don't think the end goal should necessarily simply be a top tier weapon that, I could easily just ask, oh yeah, just revert every single nerf it got and give it a broken kit. Because it's not really an interesting way to do it, that's pretty boring. I want a competently constructed weapon that makes me feel like a powerful presence on the map and a threat to my opponent. I'm not trying to add Mega Rayquaza or Zacian Crown into Splatoon 3 just because it's my favorite. No one wants to see that, so I'm not going to try and make that here. I want to eloquently have a weapon that is fun to play, engaging, rewarding to play, has a strong map presence, and given kits that complement the main weapon effectively. You can achieve all of those without making something a top 3, top 5 weapon in the game. It could simply be a high tier, that's fine. It could be a mid tier that's really fun to play. I don't care. I want the weapon to be fun again, because a lot of the fun value has kind of faded from this weapon into. So that's ultimately what I'm going for here. For kits itself, I don't want to go too in-depth on that, because this is a speculation video. I'm not going to sort of make things up on the fly about a game we barely know anything about. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of, I'm going to give it this sub and this special. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about the main weapon, because the main weapon is something that I know intimately from playing it so long, and it is my favorite thing, so I'm going to talk about that. I think that the developers need to seriously reevaluate the kind of weapon that it is and ultimately pick a lane and decide, what do you want Spot Brella to be strong at? Do you want Spot Brella to be a weapon that has strong and mobile stalling capability, like a mobile splash ball with a shotgun attached? Or do you want a weapon that has some form of stalling ability, but is more focused on immediately threatening damage and kill potential, leaning into its playstyle being a heavy flanker and distraction weapon? One of these has to be in place for the weapon to have any chance of success. You see the problem here with it in Splatoon 2 now, and why people are not picking it. The nerfs that gave Brella in Splatoon 2 targeted and nerfed both aspects of the weapon heavily, while power creeping other options within the same game, on top of other main weapon nerfs such as ink efficiency and paint. So okay, to start for Splatoon 3, I think first of all it needs some form of reverting of ink efficiency nerfs and or a reduction in white ink for opening shield. One of those. It goes a long way. Downtime in this game is very, very, very bad. This game plays very quickly, the kill times are very short. So to lose strengths in both stalling and kill potential is absolutely miserable to play against all the lagless, completely ink efficient, mobile weapons with cheap cost, high impact specials that dominate the endgame meta of Splatoon 2. 852 is a shooter with a splash wall, so it basically suffers from none of those weaknesses by comparison. Secondly, this is very specific, and this is something I could mention a bit more in depth in another video, but I think for the health of the game, in addition to making Brella more viable again, we need to seriously address the issue of last-ditch effort in Splatoon 2. The way that last-ditch effort curves is kind of atrocious because it really rewards the most ink-efficient weapons in the game, and it makes weapons like Junior, that even without it can shoot for about 20 seconds nonstop, have a big ink tank, spam bombs, and just never run out of ink basically. It just rewards them further, and the problem with that is A, that's not fun to play against, no one likes to fight bomb spam, A. But B, what Brella really hates is bomb spam, so to have LDE be a common meta-defining ability that is one main of investment for an absolutely absurd amount of efficiency is really, really bad. Because even if you have 2 to 3 LDE users on the field, if they can output the amount of bombs they want on Brella, Brella basically can't play the game. More bombs is a harder life for the Brella, and it's just exhausting to fight against as a Brella, or even just to play in general. If you've fought quad LDE in overtime before and you just happen to see like 6 bombs on the map at once, that's totally normal. I think that needs to go and not be in Splatoon 3, especially if you want Brella to be relevant again. So in general, I want that massively toned down. Thirdly, I think you need to either reduce the suction bomb damage back down to what it was before, going from 220 to 180, or you need to specifically reduce its damage to Brella. Having a lethal bomb in the game that is incredibly common and deletes 88% of the Brella's HP alone is far too drastic for my liking and creates issues when, again, it's debatably the best sub in the game or number 2 at worst. And nearly every comp you're going to run into has an ends up 85, a K-shot, some suction bomb weapon, amidst other issues I'm not even talking about in this video, such as, rapid AoE, other factors that make Brella struggle. I could go on forever about why it struggles, but I think I've made my point. But when you can slap a suction bomb weapon, especially with LDE, on a comp, it kind of ruins the Brella's day very, very easily in very, very low committal ways. I think it's a bit too easy. I think it's fine to have, commonplace measures to keep some tools and weapons in check, but I think the risk-reward as it is right now is just downright unfair and very skewed. I understand the dev's intention with that buff in 4.7 to make the slower bomb more rewarding compared to spot bomb's utility by comparison, where you can roll it and make it detonate instantly. Like, they buffed the damage on Autobomb's lethal explosion as well, but I think that's more justified because Autobomb was in a much worse state than Suction Bomb was. So okay, one more thing to talk about this video. While I can't say with any certainty the kind of kit I want to see, and I know I said I wouldn't really go in depth about that, I just want to talk about like a really quick hypothetical with that. Because I want to say, depending on how the developers decide to rebuff Brella, hoping that they do, if they don't, I'm going to be very, very sad. If we decide to make Brella a flank-heavy weapon with restored kill potential, I think the grappling special in Splatoon 3 would be quite fun with it. Would it be stronger meta-defining? Maybe not. I don't think grapple's looking great at the moment, maybe that'll change, but based on early impressions, if that's the kind of playstyle they want to go for, I think it's fun, and fun is ultimately the end goal here, not necessarily creating another top tier just because I like it. However, if we want Brella to lean into a more defensive, turtling, stalling kind of weapon, that you can kind of go wherever you want, stall, distract people, eat their shots, that kind of deal, I think that the crab tank special would be a really, really good idea because it allows for further defensive options, and it allows the Brella to temporarily increase their crossfire capability because Brella is a short-range weapon, so having a crab would help their team fights a lot. And I think it'd just be a fun option to have because Undercover Sorella kind of has this a bit in 2, where if its shield is super weak, or in the case of Undercover when it breaks because of the piece of paper, you can pop your special, and the time that you spend in the special contributes to the time it takes to regenerate your shield. And I think that's really, really fun. At the end of the day, Splatoon 2 is what it is, and while Brella may be pretty underwhelming to me now as someone who's, only gone up and become more and more competitive, and I can't really think I'm gonna bring the weapon to top level and make it work anymore. Ultimately, I appreciate and thank the devs for giving me a weapon that was my favorite to play with for years. And I look forward to Splatoon 3 in the hopes of Brella being given new life and new kits once again, so that I can revisit it maybe, and hopefully find it as fun as I used to. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you have a good day. This was Keen, and I'll see you next time.